going to be talking about advances in technology for the visually impaired. Again, my name is Rizzo, and I encourage you all to interrupt me. I will not see your hands if they're raised, even if you're waving them vigorously. You have severe tunnel vision, so just shout out. It'll be like a Sunday dinner. It's completely fine, and I encourage you to reach out at any point if something I'm saying is unclear or I'm not providing a reasonable spatial description for y'all. And please take a look at our website, reach out on social media. We would love to interact with you all. We're running clinical trials frequently at NYU, and we would love for you all to participate. Okay, so I do have some conflictual disclosures that NYU tells me I have to reveal. I'm not going to spend time talking about it, but we do have funding at the federal, state, municipal level, and also multiple private grants. I do a lot of advising, as Kathy mentioned. I serve on a number of boards. Of course, the one dearest to me is the CRF. And I thank our board of directors for all of their service. Okay, so I always like to start off with an inverted thank you because I always run out of time, no matter what I do. And so here are some of the senior leaders at NYU who helped make this work possible. I want to give them a quick shout out. Here's a small gathering of our lab team. We have about 15 or 20 of them visualized here. But in fact, our lab team on average is between 40 to 50 members, which sounds wild for a blind guy who started out with almost no funding and no experience. And I want to give a special shout out to our federal partners who need a lot of thanks and accolades given the current administration. Here are some of the program directors I've worked very closely with over the years at both the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. And we can't thank them enough, including conversations over the last 6 months, which caused me to lose even more hair. So some people have asked to give sort of a timeline of what's happened over the last 30 years of my life since I was diagnosed with choroideremia. Did we just lose the mic? Oh, sound just changed. Okay. Hopefully I'm still coming through clearly. And on the bottom left-hand side, you can actually see some fundoscopy from my very own eyes. Doesn't look very good for those who are unable to see it. And then my professional climate. So in any event, I'm happy to talk with anyone offline about this, but despite advice otherwise, I ended up going to medical school. It was a bit of a wild journey. Thank you. I think I got it off. And then I was thinking I would be one of the world's first blind ophthalmologists. That didn't work out so well. And so I pivoted into disability medicine, or physiatry. For those who are unfamiliar, please do some reading on physiatry. We're basically the kings and queens of the disability world from a medical standpoint. And it's been a wild ride, setting up my career over the last 15 years. And we're now close to $40 million in federal funding, which sounds surreal. But it's been an excellent journey. I'm happy to share some of what we've learned along the way. So I have a very ambitious agenda. I wanted to give you sort of a smorgasbord of technological innovation. I'm not going to read through this all, but we'll spend some time talking about visual disability. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about vision rehabilitation because I don't think that gets enough of the limelight. And then we'll move into some of the innovations we've created in our lab over the last decade or so. And again, please interrupt me at any point in time. So we'll start off with visual disability and a primer. And here in the middle, I have a crystal clear view of the building that our lab is currently housed within. This is at 240 East 38th Street in Manhattan. And then in each of the outer quadrants, we've recreated pathological masks as if you were looking through the eyes of some of the bigger vision killers in the United States. On the upper left-hand side, you can see a mask for macular degeneration. On the upper right-hand corner, you can see one for diabetic retinopathy. If these are unclear for you, basically imagine a crystal clear panoramic image and then having sort of moths eat through different aspects of your peripheral field. On the bottom right-hand side, we have cataracts, which sort of lowers acuity across the board. And then on the bottom left-hand side, we have glaucoma, which often restricts vision, similar to choroideremia, but also creates sort of an opacified view as if you were looking through a milk bottle. Now, I cannot overemphasize how profound functional consequences of vision loss truly are. I know for many of my fellow CHMers, we live this on a daily basis, right? But this disrupts so many aspects of our life, and it's really important to understand how these challenges, really are created over time as the progression continues. So a couple of background slides. I wanted to talk about visual disability. For those who don't know, visual disability is increasing year over year. We have about 27 million U.S. adults that report vision loss right now. If we look at worldwide estimates, we're talking about 40 million lives affected. And by 2050, those numbers are set to skyrocket to over 60 million individuals. I just want to emphasize that number, 60 million individuals. It's a huge problem. And I also like to highlight very briefly, not the point of the talk, but I think it's important to understand where we're at right now, some of the social disparities. So if we look at employment right now, unemployment's been hovering decade over decade for the last 3 or 4 decades, between 60 to 70% for those with serious visual loss. If we look at education, right now current estimates, only 15% are getting college degrees. This is wholly unacceptable in 2025. And perhaps what's saddest about it all, as a blind guy myself, is if we look at social development, blind and low vision youth have 1/2 the daily social interactions. If you look at this chart on the right-hand side, this is not my literature. This is peer-reviewed literature that we often try to double-click on in our federal grants. So again, if we have a peer who may have 15 or 20 interactions on a daily basis, and we take someone who's age-matched, visually impaired, you're going to have 50% of those interactions. So let's say 5 or 6 instead of 10, 12, or 15. And it's a little confusing because if we actually break down leisure time and some of these interactions, the total time spent in leisure is pretty identical for those without vision loss compared to those with. But where it gets really interesting is if we actually break down what's happening in those leisure activities, those who are blind and low vision are often spending their time in what we call passive leisure activities, often in isolation, which is those without visual loss are often spending their time engaged in team sports, and sort of developing themselves socially. So we're at a profound disadvantage from early on in our lives. It's also not surprising, transportation doesn't help anything. If I briefly highlight some of the transportation data, in most cases, folks who are blind and low vision prefer to rely on others for their transportation. I have a pie chart here visualizing different wedges or segments, and up to 80% prefer relying on others for transportation. In fact, 50% rely on door-to-door services, like taxi cabs or ride-hails, Ubers or Lyfts, or some of the other modern vendors that we currently have. In fact, in the recent World Health Organization's report on health equity for persons with disabilities, it was found that those with disability have a 15-fold difference as it relates to the affordability and the accessibility of transportation. So some folks in this room probably commute an hour to work, right? I'm not going to go show of hands because I won't see them. So let's just do the math on this. And this is, again, a global report written by the World Health Organization. If we use this math, 15-fold increase, that's a 15-hour commute to work. How is this sustainable? So it's no surprising we have very little college education and we have terrible jobs data, right? I mean, we're not built for success, so we have to change this. I want to highlight some Impaired data that we've collected over the years, and I'd like to start off with this to just sort of paint a narrative of a single day in New York City. I took some of these photos, although I have thousands of photos that I've taken over the last 20 or 30 years of my life. This is a day in February, just walking to the hospital, going in between some of the buildings, and then returning from the hospital to my apartment on the west side here at Penn Station. So I have different pictures. I don't know if you can see any of these snapshots visualized. For those who are unable to see them, I have pictures of sidewalk segments that are being busted up by tree roots. I have uneven expansion joints, which are those seams in between the sidewalk segments. I have random luggage and chairs and tables just in the middle of the sidewalk in New York City. And perhaps the best that takes the cake is if you look on the right-hand side, there's some street work currently happening. And there's a hole that's probably 15 feet deep in just the middle of this, I think was 35th Street and 3rd Avenue. With one safety cone and a thin line of caution tape there. I did not see. And so I almost walked into this hole. Until I realized it at the last moment. But the reality is in New York City, I've been hit by 5 bicycles, 2 scooters, and sort of 1 car. And it's really unsafe, particularly in urban environments, right? And a lot of these urban environments don't do us any advantages. So these are big problems. I'm not going to have time to go through all of the specifics here, but here are some of the challenges. A lot of us use technology. It's riddled with problems, particularly in urban environments. We have the urban canyon effect for those who are using GPS solutions, which is the overwhelming majority of a lot of the electronic travel aids that we all leverage. There's a lot of issues as it relates to inaccessible signage. There are a myriad of obstructions and hazards on roads and sidewalks. And then there are the sort of the last few years challenge as it relates to obscure storefronts and entrances, all sorts of problems. And if we go in the indoor environment, a lot of people think our challenges stop, and that's wholly untrue. When we go into the interior space, again, we have loads of inaccessible signage. We have complicated, confusing routes. In most cases, even like the Mall of the America, a lot of the hospitals that I frequent on a daily basis, every hallway is identical to every other one. So you have what we call perceptual aliasing, which creates all sorts of problems. We have visual media overload with these kiosks that are difficult to use and with too much blue light. And lots of other storefronts that it is very, very difficult to see. Okay, so I think I covered that. And if we look at some of the data, it's estimated that up to 87% for moderately and severe low vision and blindness were just not confident navigating indoor spaces. In fact, 75% or so estimate that navigating hospitals is particularly difficult. So how are we going to leverage services, at our doctor's offices? This becomes very, very difficult. And there are issues as it relates to inconsistent layouts, wide open areas when you so often sort of walk in these beautiful, atria that they've set up, largely inaccessible with poor contrast. Oftentimes, it can be sensory overload as it relates to noise or brightness. A lot of shiny surfaces, obnoxious lighting, which is very difficult and creates photopsias for many of us with inherited retinal diseases. And of course, crowds, right, which creates another problem. So let's take a look at some of the data as I mentioned before. So here was a simple head-to-head comparison. This was a navigation exercise we did in our lab. And the goal was simple, was find the lab. So we took one lab member who was brand new to our lab, we brought him to the elevator bay, and we said, find our lab, and we gave him a 2D floor plan, as you would typically get when you go to a new space. And then we did the same thing with the visually impaired lab member who was brand new. So you can see what his degeneration looks like on the right-hand side of the mask that we created as if we were looking through his eyes. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you the evolving video for the lab member on the left, and then this new lab member on the right that had the visual impairment with that superimposed mask. And you can see how difficult it is for him to capture details of the built environment, trying to figure out where reception is so he can orient himself, trying to figure out where he is on that 2D floor plan as he tries to go back and forth and explore space. I'm not going to spend too much time. Here's a chaperone view of the individual lab member without a visual impairment on the left, and on the right-hand side, you can see this visually impaired lab member. Again, naive to this floor, first time they were ever on the floor. And what I have to the left side of each of these video feeds is you can actually see the revolving trajectory on the 2D floor plan, which we created with some animation, animations. So you can see on the right-hand side, the trajectory is very meandering for this new lab member with a visual impairment. He's sort of checking himself, he's going back and forth. I'm not going to spend time showing you this entire trajectory because it takes too long, but here's what the complete or the overall trajectory looked like by the time he got to that red flag, which was our lab, which was not far. So the individual on the left with no visual impairment, ended up taking, I don't know why this is not showing, but I have some data here, ended up taking about 30 seconds, and the individual on the right-hand side took about a 300% increase, almost 3 times the total amount of time in order to complete that very simple journey from the elevator bay to our lab on the opposite side of the floor plan. So profound differences. And you may be saying, that makes sense, it's an unfamiliar environment, but let's go with an outdoor exercise. So here was another simple head-to-head comparison we did. This was outdoor navigation, and the goal was simple. It was find a subway. So we were at Lighthouse Field headquarters, which is West 64th Street, near Central Park, and the goal was to find a subway. We gave everyone a Google Maps handout to show them how they were supposed to navigate. The walk from Lighthouse Field headquarters to the subway is about a half a mile. Again, we had a chaperone with them to make sure everything was okay, and we just recorded a couple of variables, things like total time taken, speed, and our overall trajectory. And interestingly, although we don't spend enough time looking at this, we also monitor residual gaze. So one common misconception in the blind community is that if you're blind, you don't have residual vision. All of us at this group know that's nonsense. In fact, 80% of those who are blind with serious or advanced and severe low vision have remaining vision, right? And it's important to figure out how to leverage it. So what were they doing as they navigate? I'm not going to have time to go through this study, which is about to be published, but what I wanted to show you is some evolving graphs as the individuals walked from the headquarters to that subway and checking in at different time points or different epochs. So let's say every 20 or 30 seconds, we looked at how much how much distance they actually covered on their walk to the subway. And as you can see, as time goes on, the blind individuals fell behind over and over again. And we did this in a cohort for those with peripheral vision loss, similar to CHM, and then we did this in a cohort for central vision. But basically, the story is the same. At each temporal checkpoint, we end up falling behind, and then falling behind, and it becomes a compound problem. So what we did in this study is we wanted to look at, how would this relate to the average city commute? So in New York City, believe it or not, the average commute is about a half an hour. In fact, the typical individual who works in New York probably covers anywhere between 5 to 7 miles. So if we follow these losses in efficiency, on average, someone with moderate to severe visual impairment spends an average of 10 additional minutes for each of these trips. Okay, and if we add that up over a typical day, we're probably losing between a half hour to an hour every single day of lost productivity. I want to just leave this with you. Almost an hour every single day in lost productivity. This is a huge problem. We're not focusing on it enough. What's even more is if we looked at residual vision, how these visually impaired individuals were leveraging what they had intact from a visual function standpoint, we saw profound differences between those with healthy vision or with no visual impairment compared to those with tunnel vision or central vision. I'm not going to have time to go into this again. This is a smorgasbord to just give you sort of an overview and a meta-level understanding of what we're doing in the lab, and happy to take questions after the fact. But you can see in them, in red is what healthy vision looks like, sort of centered in the middle of your field. And then you can see for those with tunnel vision and with central vision in green and yellow, which is sort of the average of where gaze ended up in the field of view, okay? You can see very odd pictures in terms of how folks are leveraging the residual vision in order to walk and complete these journeys. And we need to understand this. What's happening with residual vision as we're walking? How can we leverage residual vision more in our daily life so we can be safer and ultimately more efficient? That's really what's key. And the bottom line, before I get into some of the innovation, I didn't want to just give you work from our group. This is from a great friend named Nick Giudice up at the University of Maine. He published this in 2019. I often cite this slide, but it's sort of made additionally special here because he did this work at the Mall of the America. And what's really interesting is he set up a bunch of navigation experiments for those without visual impairment compared to those with visual impairment. And here's where it gets really exciting. Look at the bar graph on the left here, if you can see it. He basically shows what ends up happening if you give a visually impaired individual conventional instructions and your performance suffers. But guess what happens if you give those without visual impairment and those with visual impairment a navigation aid? This one happens to use geomagnetic technology. It's not worth the details. You perform the same as those without visual impairment. Okay? So it's just a technological gap. We can perform just as well as anyone else. It's just an information access issue. And there are no problems as it relates to what we call spatial cognition. So bottom line, if we're given the right tools, we succeed and we do just as well as everyone else. Damn straight. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about vision rehabilitation, because this is not a topic that we often have time to discuss. So what is vision rehabilitation for those who are unfamiliar in the room? Residual vision, you can think about, is leveraging the remaining vision, or what we call residual vision. Again, 80% of the blindness sector. It's also using different strategies and technologies to help solve key tasks during daily living. And bottom line is it's important to improve quality of life. So what are the vision rehabilitation services include? Because maybe you've had some of these services, but you weren't aware that this is often called vision rehabilitation. It has to do with employment and job training. It has to do with transportation and household service help. It has to do with leveraging assistive products in different areas of our life. It has to do with technology use. It has to do with independent living skills. And lastly, emotional support. All within the vision rehab bucket. I'm not going to have time to go into all of these areas, but vision rehab, you can think of this, they're falling into 4 primary buckets. One is household activities. Another one is supporting reading, writing, and communication across the board, no matter where we are. Another one is mobility. And the last one is thinking about maximizing visual function for things like glare. Okay? And AR coatings on our glasses. I'm sure many of us in this room have them. So what are the management options? Some of you probably have used these management options. Obviously, spectacles. Sometimes high-powered reading glasses or telescopes and magnifiers. It can be tints and filters. I see some folks using them here. It could be basic and advanced assistive technologies. It could be lighting modifications, task lighting, for example, glare reduction, etc., etc. These are some of the management options in the vision rehab bucket. Now, it gets a little confusing because a lot of what we hear about for example, with Ray Therapeutics, is what we would call vision restoration. And that's what gets a lot of the limelight in vision rehab. But there are two other areas that are really critical. One is visual compensation, and this is improving visual function through behaviors or through technology. Okay, and then the other area that we're going to spend a bunch of time talking about today is what we call visual substitution or sensory substitution. This is taking visual media and remapping it into an intact sense, through touch or through audio, and often both. And we're going to show you, probably for the first time done, actually what we call trimodal sensory substitution. More on that in a moment. So a lot of times what we're doing in vision rehabilitation is leveraging technology. I just wanted to give you sort of a broad sweeping overview of how this works. We have very simple technologies like white canes, many of us are using, easy to maintain, limited or no electronics, although there's more and more smart canes, especially in recent days and years. We have sort of a middle ground, and then we have a high-tech version, sort of high-touch, more abilities, more electronics, battery-powered, etc. And that sort of gives you an overview of how we set up the landscape. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this if we have limited time, but again, we have white canes and guide dogs, simple and basic, no electronics, and then we go into better electronics, better software. So Seeing AI is a perfect example. I'm sure many folks in this room have used Seeing AI. But the bottom line of what I want to highlight about assistive technology is there is a profound emergence. According to the World Health Organization, globally, over 1 billion people need one or more assistive products. And with aging, the estimates are that greater than 2 billion people will need one or more assistive products by 2030. That's only 5 years away. Today, only 1 in 10 people have access to the assistive technology that they need. Let me read that one more time. 1 in 10. That's 10% are getting the tools that they need. This is absolutely ridiculous, and we need to work harder to make sure that we can get the technology that helps to create that sort of equalization, if you will. Another big problem that we have in this area, and again, I'm ripping through a lot of content that oftentimes are presentations in of themselves, but again, hopefully we're planting the seeds, and these seeds will germinate, is this idea of care coordination. So we're hearing from ophthalmologists, oftentimes we're talking to ophthalmologists, this is really assessing our disease at an organ level, what we call visual function. But the problem is we're not really thinking about how we leverage our remaining visual function in everyday life, what we often call functional vision. This is where the vision rehab comes in. More on that later, and if time during questions. And the reason this is so important, and we created this schematic, we actually pitched and presented this at the National Eye Institute, at the National Institutes of Health, is that a lot of our energy and funding is focused on what we call lightening the load, organ level impairment. Right? So we go to an ophthalmologist, they try to assess our disease, and they try to take away some of that impairment. So we have this truck analogy here. So imagine I had a dump truck filled with boulders. The ophthalmologists are trying to take away those boulders so we have a light load so our truck can go farther. But what about building a bigger damn truck? Right? Why can't we get more horsepower, more turbochargers, and figure out how to manage that load? That's where vision rehabilitation comes in. It doesn't get enough attention. Okay. Enough with that. Let's talk about AI and the proliferation of AI. And I'm going to say some things that are optimistic, some things that are pessimistic, what we call affectionately friend or foe. So I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, but for those who aren't, AI is everywhere. Unprecedented uptake of new AI tools, massive and expanding market size. So what I have here in these two schematics are something I grabbed from a business executive, and I thought these infographics were very revealing. On the left-hand side, you can see the uptake of some of the new advances we've had in modern day life. And at the top, you can see Netflix, and this shows how long it took to reach 1 million lives, sort of the adoption uptake, if you will. Now, Netflix reached 1 million users in 2.5 years. Guess how long it took ChatGPT to reach 1 million users? I don't know if you can see the slide. 5 days. 5 days. So I'm sure everyone uses Netflix, but the uptake is really unprecedented. On the right-hand side, you can see market growth expectation, and it's going through the trillion dollar market. It's absolutely unbelievable. But I would argue, even though AI has a lot of promise for us in the blind community, there are a lot of gaps. And the problem is, right now, AI, as we're currently using it, for those who are using the meta glasses, and I'm sure you all can attest to this, it's often unfocused. It doesn't know how to focus on task specificity or what I need in the moment. So here I have some examples of common AI tools, and you can see they're identifying objects, but they're not identifying the object you need. Now, this is getting better with generative AI, but it's still a big problem. So we need to think about how we can leverage this and how we can improve the user interfaces and the user experiences so we can have more impactful solutions, okay? I'm not going to have too much time to talk about this. Another big problem is oftentimes the control logic is too simple. So a lot of times, like for example, if you're using Seeing AI, there are 7 modes or 7 channels. You can only use 1 channel at a time. Well, what if I want to use 2 channels at a time? Why can't I have that multimodal control so I can put on 2 of those settings or 2 of those features simultaneously? That would make my life easier, right? So what can we do in order to make AI more focused? So we're thinking about ways to add more top-down control. And I think a lot of times we think about bottom-up support, something is shiny over here, I want to look at it, as opposed to sort of figuring out a plan or a best practice. And that's part of what we're doing in our work. I also think it's really important that we think about tailoring the products for our own individualized use and making them more precise. So here we have an example of an individual wearing the meta glasses, and he's using OCR in the meta glasses to read the menu. But he has to sit there for 15 minutes when it turns out he's a vegetarian. There's only one damn thing on the menu that's vegetarian. So why can't he just say, I'm a veggie lover, and read me that one item, right? So instead of taking 10 minutes, it takes him 10 seconds. This is what we're trying to think about. Another point I like to make is a lot of times these tools would be the equivalent or the analogy of having a drill with the same bit, right? And if I'm doing tool work, or if I'm trying to build something, or I'm doing a project, it would be having a set of drills, each with only 1 bit. Okay, we need to come up with more flexible, interoperable products so I can support everyday function and specific tasks that I want to do. Okay, enough said about that background. Now we're going to get into the fun stuff. Maybe I should pause really briefly to see if there are any questions, because we did about 7 lectures in 15 and a half minutes. But as you all know, I am for leaver. Any questions before we move into some of the Okay, so I think there are no questions. There are no questions. Am I getting this mic closer to you? Closer to me? Oof. Yes. That may be a problem.
Turn the volume down.
Okay.
But that's going to keep the feedback down.
Oh.
You're talking with your hands because you're
I can't avoid it. It's impossible. I would need gene therapy. Thank you. Okay. So let's talk about the frontiers of assistive technology. I never talk that close to a microphone, so this is going to be surreal. Okay. So I'm going to start off each of these sections with a problem landscape overview. So let's talk about assistive technologies in general. AT is often, or assistive technology, I'm going to use that acronym frequently, is often what we call a single point solution. And there's a lack of interoperability between the tools that we currently use. Okay, this is what I was just referring to with that drill analogy. Again, imagining you had a drill that had a locked bit, and you didn't have the option to change the bit. That would make that drill pretty silly and futile to use when you're building for a project. So there are a lot of associated pain points. In the interest of time, I'm going to zip forward. So what we've been thinking about is walking away from single tool development and really creating what we call an integrated assistive companion. So for those in the room who've heard me talk before, we've created a couple of different integrated platform solutions. What's a platform solution? If you think of a platform solution as almost like a solution lazy Susan, where I can integrate multiple sets of software or scripts, and then I can have access to all of them simultaneously. Now we have sort of 2 different initiatives where we build these platform technologies. We have what we call Vision to the 4th Mobile, which is a visually impaired smart service system for spatial intelligence and onboard navigation. It took me 1 year to get that acronym right. And then we have what we call the Vision Wearable Platform, which you can think of as being a smart integrated backpack. So we basically take backpacks, we build cameras into them, we load software on these embedded systems in the backpack itself with some laptop batteries, and you're off to your own devices, serving as an assistive companion. And we have all sorts of neat innovation that we built into this over the last 10 years with some of our National Science Foundation funding. The next is optimizing AI services. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples on different projects. We're going to talk about wayfinding and orientation. We're going to highlight some of our navigation work, particularly in indoor environments, probably the most exciting part of the talk. Then we're going to talk about travel safety. What do I mean about travel safety? I mean obstacle avoidance or negotiation. Also trip hazard indicators or prompting, and we'll talk specifically about curves. I'm sure everyone in this room with choroideremia has tripped on a curve or two in their life. And then lastly, if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about scene exploration and user interaction. Now, we affectionately have sort of code names for these projects. We call our navigation platform UNAV for Latin, Ubique Navigare, which means universal navigation. For our obstacle negotiation pipeline, we call it virtual whispers. More on that in a moment. Curve detectors couldn't go in. It's called curve detector. And then lastly, for this trimodal sensory substitution and scene exploration, this project is called point detector, basically turning your finger into a digital laser pointer so you can grab objects that you're interested in finding. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the navigation space. So navigation is often not safe or inefficient due to inaccessible spaces. And unfortunately, a lot of the available tools are lackluster. I'm sure everyone in this room has been handed a 2D floor plan or a map that's largely inaccessible, and it's very difficult, particularly in unfamiliar environments, to navigate. So what are some of the problems, even for those of us who are using outdoor technologies, right? The problem is if I use a GPS-based solution and I walk into an indoor environment like the Mall of America, that GPS solution doesn't work anymore because of non-line of sight with a satellite, right? So we have no handoffs, or again, that interoperability term that I used before. We also have a lot of difficulties for those technologies that lean on mapping. So those in the room have probably heard of Good Maps or Way Maps or other mapping initiatives, which are using very expensive LiDAR scanning in order to build these digital models so you can then localize yourself in space. And that takes a ton of time, energy, and resources, so it's unsustainable. And we have a very fragmented solution space. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the downsides. I just want to, again, create a little bit of an understanding in the problem landscape. So what we've been thinking about in navigation and UNAV specifically is to stand up camera-based, infrastructure-free, step-by-step wayfinding guidance. And I'm going to give you sort of a 10,000-foot overview in terms of how this works. So we do have a pre-mapping stage. Instead of using expensive LiDAR scanners, we have our students walk around with GoPro cameras. Commercially available, they cost a couple of $100 online. It's as simple as walking through all of the navigable spaces in a built environment once or twice. And then what we do is we actually, so let me see if this pops up. So you can actually see the individuals here mapping spaces. You can see the view from the camera. And then I go through a rapid process of AI-based feature extraction. This is finding unique visual elements in the built environment, like unique signs, unique exit signs, unique door frames, unique edges, unique walls, and I extract those visual features. And then I have a process called georeferencing, which is what the satellites are providing for GPS solutions. But I do this on our back end, and I match those visual features with locations on the 2D floor plan. That's what gives me the spatial knowledge I need to spin up what we call a digital model, or a lightweight, we call place maps or topo maps. So you can see on the right-hand side, we have the trajectory of the mapper, and these little sort of hazy point clouds are all the visual features that we figured out and where they are relative to the floor plan itself. And once I have that mapping file, here's where it gets exciting. By the way, every 10 or 15,000 square feet, we can map it in about 10 to 15 minutes to give you a sense of what we call the mapping efficiency. Speaking to sustainability, as I mentioned before. So then you're an end user, you want to figure out where Cinnabon is in the Mall of America. You open up our UNAV proprietary app, you take a picture, we extract the visual features, we leverage the georeference visual features in our database that we already created, and within about 1 to 2 seconds using that mapping file, I can figure out where you are. You then say, you're interested in going to Cinnabon, right? So Cinnabon is associated with a unique 2D floor location in this topo file or this topo map. And based on that, we use a shortest path planner algorithm to connect your origin. This is where you start to your targeted destination, which is Cinnabon, and we give you step-by-step instructions. And what you can see on the bottom right-hand side in this second pipeline is we have an end user actually walking through Lighthouse Guild and finding one of the research officers' actual office for a meeting, and getting step-by-step instructions on the right-hand side, which I won't read in the interest of time. But as Warner Wolf used to say, let me go to the videotape. We do have audio descriptions, but again, let me know if this is unclear. This is real data that we recorded from Lighthouse Guild. This is a blind individual. This is not staged. And again, she's trying to get to a specific targeted destination at Lighthouse Guild. Is that coming through the microphone? So for those who can't see the screen, the individual is walking away from the elevator bay into the first hallway. Another photo is taken with the UNAV app. It says image uploaded to the server, and within less than 1 second, she's given her next set of instructions. This is point-by-point wayfinding.
It was great to talk about.
Another image was uploaded. She's now being told to turn right. You can basically think of this as a virtual chaperone. She's standing in front of a large table with a bunch of chairs. It's instructed to turn almost at the final destination. And on the right-hand side, you can see some overviews that we've created in order to help you on the user interface with increased contrast for those who do have residual vision. And she ends up achieving her final destination. So hopefully that helps make sense. That was sort of a quick demo. Again, we often spend 1 hour talking about that in isolation. But let me get to sort of the good news here. We just finished our first clinical trial, and I have some data to show for you. Before I get into the clinical trial, you may be asking, well, how accurate is this image-based localization? So we did a detailed technical validation, and on average, even using this rapid GoPro mapping, we're between 1 to 2 feet of spatial accuracy. So that means if you take a photo, let's say near the entrance to the Mall of the America, on average, we're between 12 to 24 inches, knowing exactly where you're dropping your pin, but we're dropping that pin automatically, okay? And what's even cooler about this technology is not only can we give you 2D spatial orientation, we can also give you your bearing angle. So what direction am I facing in? And we did even better there with, on average, 2 to 3 degrees of angular error. And if you look across this technical validation, which, by the way, we did in a hospital, this wasn't in a controlled laboratory environment, this consistency is replicated across the entire floor plan. So we don't have some areas of the floor plan, that was another mic hit for those who are attracted to mic hits, high degree of reliability across the entire floor plan, which is really exciting. So let me get into the clinical trial data. Believe it or not, for a number of reasons, we actually did this in Thailand to make it more challenging for ourselves. But the goal was to give someone basic, sort of vanilla instructional guidance from a chaperone and compare that to virtual guidance through UNAV. So we took 20 severely visually impaired students, grad students, and staff members. We gave them a little tutorial on UNAV, but only a few minutes. And then they were told, okay, go to these specific destinations. On average, these were approximately 1, 2, 3 minute journeys, which had 2 to 4 turns in them, and they were all within the same floor plan, so they didn't have to deal with stairs or elevators. And again, we did what we call passive support, with the chaperone giving them detailed verbal instructions, which is sort of what we experience on a day-to-day basis. That was the control, and we compared it to UNAV in terms of virtual support. Now, we did this in a university environment outside of Bangkok. Again, I can explain the rationale behind that later. And this is what we call, for the scientists in the room, a non-inferiority crossover study, we counterbalance it. So here's some on-the-ground footage from Thailand with some of the topo maps we created. You can actually see some of the views of the beautiful campus outside Bangkok on the Salaya. You can also see one of the end users on the bottom left-hand side. They're wearing our wearable, which is basically an instrumented backpack with some cameras, and the individual does have a helmet on with some additional video recording equipment. That's not part of the technology, but we did that to make sure we could really understand how well he or she navigated. Okay. So what did we find? Not only did we find that UNAV was more successful in terms of navigation success, meaning they got to their targeted destination, but we were better at 9 out of 10 dependent variables, which we did not expect. Again, the goal was to match the chaperone instructions, what we call non-inferior, just be about the same as the chaperone instructions. That was our goal. But we did much better on total time taken, meaning we cut down on the total time taken to complete that journey. We cut down on the distance traveled because the individuals traveled more efficiently. We cut down on wrong turns. And if we look at pathing efficiency, again, compared to an optimal path as if the bird was flying between your starting point and your targeted destination, we were much more optimal with UNAV. The only dependent variable that we did not improve on is gait speed. And bear in mind, this was a short walk and the individuals had never used this technology before. So we didn't expect to see a change there. If we look at hesitation time, this is another exciting point. The amount of times we sort of stop to reorient, we cut down on the total number of idle periods, and we also cut down on the total idle time or the total hesitation time. We also have chaperones there for help requests. We cut down on help requests, and here's what's also really exciting, pain contacts. How many times I had to bounce off a wall, doing shorelining to orient myself, we cut down significantly on pain contacts. I have these scattered bar plots on the right, but I'm just giving you the sort of top line messaging here. So the bottom line is this worked really darn well. We also find that UNAV was more beneficial for those who were fully blinded compared to those who had low vision. We think that's probably because they just listened to the input with a little more fidelity, if you will. Okay, I'm not going to have time to go into some of the UNAV, the additional UNAV metrics, but the bottom line is going to give it that time. Okay, not too bad. I should probably speed up. We improved in spatial, chemical, and confidence domains, and the bottom line is this worked really well. We also are just about to publish a qualitative study where how the end users viewed the technology, and for this first prototype, overall, they were big fans of it, and in most cases, every one of them wanted to use the technology again, which was very promising. So you may be saying, this sounds cool, JR, but where are you going with this? And, you know, it may be unsustainable to do that pre-mapping component. But even though you're using these GoPro cameras, which are commercially available, and that's basically the number one point of feedback we get from peer scientists and from members of the community. So what we're doing is we're trying to go fully autonomous if we're using quadruped robots. So here you can see some of the robots that we've been working with. This is from a company called Unitree, and we've built these custom mounts that hold our GoPro cameras. I'm going to play some videos here of our little four-legged friends. Let me see if this works. So you can see a quadruped robot. This is not a simulated environment. This is the actual hospital. Security loves when we have our little quadruped robots for your image. Oftentimes, not friends of us. But hopefully you can get a sense that we're trying to automate some of the mapping processes. The other thing that's really exciting for those of us who use navigation technologies, oftentimes it only works floor by floor. So we're trying to really think about scalability and sustainability. And so we have some new projects where we're moving from floor level travel, which we call intra-floor, to intra-floor travel. We call this multi-floor UNAV. So this is going from like the 5th floor, let's say your current hotel room, getting to the elevator bay, transitioning through the elevator, then coming out on the 2nd floor in that little atrium, and then figuring out where you're going in the technology, picking up where it left off and giving you instructions on both floors. What's even more is we're moving into what we call setting changes. So that's going from an indoor environment into an outdoor environment. So imagine going from the 5th floor to the lobby, navigating each of those floor plans, and then going outside using the same exact technology. Not needing to load another application, we're using another technology. And most recently, we're using generative AI in order to improve the experience. I'm not going to have too much time to go into this, but the bottom line is we're trying to think about other ways to improve the value of the service. And what we're doing here is what's missing from this global navigation support, sort of knowing that I need to walk forward 100 feet and then turn right, is the local pathing piece. So that's how do I negotiate around obstacles in the floor plan, like a random chair or a random walker, or maybe even another blinking to make sure I don't trip while I'm completing each segment of my journey. This is cool. I think I have the video in a moment playing that. So there are different things that we can do when we use generative AI to help improve this experience. You can basically think of the UNAV plus generative AI. We've actually trained our own model that we call this Percept. This can do different things like scene understanding. So not only can you get navigation instructions, we can explain the environment around you to give you some spatial details. We can do risk assessments, like for example, navigating around a walker. And we can also do object localization, like walking into breakfast this morning and figuring out where the damn coffee is, right? That would be helpful. So we're working on all of those service ads. Here's sort of a demonstration of what it would look like once operationalized, and I have an image here showing the individual first-person view getting navigation instructions, but curving around the trash can in the hallway. Again, sort of bringing together that localization piece, where am I? The global pathing piece, how do I get to a targeted destination? And then that last piece, which is local pathing, which is negotiating around specific objects. Okay. So rather than explaining more of this, let me just see if this video plays. A bit variable, but I'll answer that question. Can you all hear that?
Repeat the question.
Yeah. Let me just play this one more time. Unfortunately, I can't see the cursor. Anyway, I'll just explain what's happening. So the individual is using UNAV, they have their phone out, and what's basically happening is it's saying, in essence, walk forward 100 feet and then turn right, and there happens to be an office chair that someone in that office left out. And so what it's saying, curve left around the office chair to make sure that not only you're getting your navigation instructions, but you're also not going to bump into that chair or the trip on it. The question that was asked.
Walk 9 steps forward.
Oh.
You are in the hallway. Your path is clear of obstacles.
What are you using? Are you using a phone as the seeing device?
Correct. It's a phone with the camera pointed outwards, yes.
Turn right to 3 o'clock.
So this will be an app, correct?
This current version is an app, yes. Yes.
Any idea when it will
Walk
be
10 steps
available?
forward. You are in the hallway.
Yeah, good question. So we actually have.
10 steps.
Let me just let it start to talk over the video. Let me just.
Closed doors are visible in the immediate path.
I don't know if you can hear, but it's talking about signs in the background. It's giving you that logo. Sorry. Oh yeah, no problem. Thank you. But basically, you're getting all of those elements that would be important from different service offerings integrated into one platform. The question up in the front, there were two, was are these currently being used in different clinical trials? And the answer to that is yes, but it depends on the technology. We spent more time talking about it at the end. And the other question was, is this currently available? Is it an app and is it available in the App Store? And if so, if it's not, when is it going to be available? We have a beta version of that of our app that should be available soon. I'm not sure yet because we have a production team rebuilding what we've created, because once you release something into the commercial marketplace, it takes on an entirely different life of its own. And we're currently working through that right now. But maybe even this year or early next year. Now that I'm talking more. Okay, let me get into the next technology. I'm probably not going to have time to go into this in too many details, but I think this is really important. Obstacle avoidance. I'm sure everyone here trips on multiple objects every single day. How can we more seamlessly navigate or negotiate obstacles in the built environment? Because they are inevitable, even in spaces that are more accessible. By the way, it's currently estimated that across the board, only 4% of built environments are accessible for those with disability. 4%. 96% are inaccessible. So we need technology to help and to keep us safe. So what we've been doing and thinking about for a long time is there are a lot of animal species that have terrible visual systems, yet they navigate and negotiate life really well. Some of them leverage touch, some of them use other sensors, some of them use mechanoreception. They use all different techniques and approaches in order to navigate life successfully. So we thought, wouldn't it be fun if we could build virtual whiskers that stick out of your trunk, give it haptics, and then use image processing to catch sight of different obstacles, and then to remap that onto these vibrotactile interfaces that you would wear, almost as if you were feeling your way through space. We tested this in medical students first. Only one died. I'm just kidding, the medical students died. And now we have this in clinical trials in the lab right now for those who are blind and low vision. This is what we would call intuitive tactile sensory substitution, visual media into touch. And we have two different ways that we offer this virtual whiskers, if you will. We have one where we take proximal objects and we vibrate them onto this tactile interface. You have to move away from the vibration. And we have another one, because a lot of people, it's really funny, I'll never forget the first time we tested this on a participant. And she said, JR, she's like, I really like this. I think it has a lot of potential, but you're going to vibrate my abdomen off. And so we thought more about that. We took it to heart. We came up with what we call open path mode, which is actually figuring out where the obstacles are, where there is traversable space, and then we push you into that traversable space with no objects through vibration. So you get one walking away from the vibration and the other one walking to the vibration, depending on the mode. Again, we spend an hour just going on these slides, so I know this is a lot, but hopefully planting the seed. So how does this work at a 10,000 foot overview? On the left-hand side, you can see a camera positioned on our smart backpack. In the middle, you can actually see the tactile interface we built. It's basically a bunch of clips that you can put on your belt, and they have built tactile motors similar to the motors you have in your phone for vibrotactile feedback. And on the right-hand side is sort of putting those two pieces together into this haptic interface. And again, I told you we have two different modes. This is how the first mode works. So it's sort of feeling your way through space. So we take proximal objects, and then based on how many vibrators you're wearing on that belt, right, we vibrate that particular unit in correspondence to where that particular location is in an image frame. So we take image frames from the camera, and then we separate that into little capture fields, so we pixelate it, and then based on where those objects are in correspondence to that little vibration unit on your belt, we would vibrate it, and then as that object got closer, we would increase the intensity and the frequency of that vibratory motor. Okay, so again, it's basically walking away from the vibration. We also have this open path mode, which I mentioned to you before. So here you can see one of our participants walking through a city park in New York. There's a bunch of random hazards, and you can see us constantly assessing traversable space and then pushing the individual into that green column, which is being illuminated right now, if you can see it. But basically, in short, it's follow the buzzing towards the most traversable space. Okay. What did we find out in our first pilot trial? We set up an obstacle course. I'm not going to go into specific details, and we tested both the sort of object mode, walking away from the vibration, and then follow the vibration mode, which we call open path. And the bottom line is, it was a resounding success. And the other question that we often get from the community is, does this take more time to incorporate into my daily living? And the answer to that is no. I'm not going to interpret all of these scattered line graphs, but the bottom line is it took no additional time to use these technologies. But where it got really exciting on this obstacle course is we cut down on the hesitation time again. So people were more confident in their travel. And where it gets really exciting is when we look at the distance of the end user to the obstacles, we increase the safety window. Meaning, the margin that you had as it relates to potential trip hazards was increased and you were safer during your travel, which was really exciting to see. Okay, let me briefly talk about curve detection, and we'll see if we can show a little bit of it again. Bottom line is there are very rudimentary curve detection pipelines out there, but most of them don't work very well. And when they do, they're unidimensional. They only sort of focus on one thing about the curve. So what we decided to do is to use some generative AI to see if we can come up with a better curve detection algorithm, and then to talk about multiple properties of the curve itself and communicate that to the end user seamlessly. So not just where is the closest curve and how far is it from me, but also the orientation of the curve, so I can make sure I step up or step down appropriately. And you can think of this as, I'm sure many of us have been in a car that has sort of smart bumper protection, right? So as you get closer to the bumper in front of you, you hear this little auditory chirping that increases in frequency, like beep, 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 until it goes continuous, right? And so what we did was we basically created that virtually. And so the individual is wearing that either tactile interface where they have a bone conduction headset in, and we're able to create that same effect. So we take the image frames from the camera you're wearing on the smart backpack, as I introduced before, the vision wearable. We then rapidly process the image frames. We figure out which curve is closest to you, and then based on the distance from the curve to yourself, we end up creating a sort of a distance alert, and then we also create an orientation alert. We do this in a couple of different flavors, but in the interest of time, I'm going to zip through this, and I'm happy to take questions during lunch. The bottom line is, let me see if I can play this for you. Can you hear this? Yeah. So the individual is walking up to a curve that happens sort of a slight angle towards the right, and you hear the auditory beeping increase. And that sort of scaled tone, if you will, is the actual orientation, the sonified orientation of the curve. And so we're actually working on auditory aesthetics to make more pleasing sounds when we do these remappers. That's a whole other lecture in of itself. But we completed our first clinical trial on this last summer, and the bottom line is also resounding success. So not only were folks able to detect the orientation of the curve just as well as using a cane, but we also increased the safety window again. I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, but again, I just want to sort of give you an overview. And the last, we'll talk a little bit about scenic exploration. So this is adding that third mode to the conventional sensory substitution that we're often familiar with, which is using either touch or sound. And so you can imagine I get into a space that I'm entirely unfamiliar with, and I'm trying to find where my bottle of beer is on my friend's counter, and I don't know where it is, right? So what if I could turn my finger into a laser pointer, and as my finger sweeps through space, I could process the images coming from the camera on the backpack, and then associate them relative to the current finger position in the frame. Because as I'm pointing, the camera can see the fingertip and the surrounding objects, and I can tell you when you get hit. So you can almost imagine this as like Spidey sense. So I'm sort of, if I'm Spider-Man, I'm shooting my Spidey web in the direction of my pointed, and then I'm able to grab those objects. And the cool thing is I can adapt this depending on the size of the net. If I want a big net to catch a bunch of objects over here, if I'm shopping, I can describe them actually. but again, giving AI more focus, not focusing on the entire field of view. So I'm sitting there for 35 minutes to get every product in my field of view. Instead, I'm focusing on the areas over here and where the IPAs are, because that's what I want to purchase in the rear section. Okay? Corey McDonald helped me with that demonstration. Seven points on it. Thank you, Corey. He always knows where the IPAs are. Spidey sense. So, in any event, we're sort of building those sort of digital laser pointers, again, in virtual means. I'm not going to go through this, some of the background on this. I think that sort of makes sense. We did a small trial a couple of years ago when we were thinking about this as an idea, and we did a shopping simulation. And we were just as successful in identifying objects compared to digital exploration. You have a bunch of items on the floor. That's another mic hit. I apologize to the AV team. We have a bunch of products sitting on a shelf, right? We asked the visually impaired individual, please let us know what each of these objects are. So using this new pointing sensory substitution, we did just as well as if you digitally explored these objects. But what got really exciting is if we ask you to digitally explore a bunch of objects, like let's say you can't read the fine print in a store and you're trying to differentiate a couple of objects, we actually wanted to look at the total time to complete the task for product identification. And what was interesting is using this technology, we cut down on the total task time by 50%. So if you're going shopping, you're going to the store, you're spending 45 minutes, imagine cutting that down hypothetically to 20 minutes, okay, to improve the efficiency using some of this technology. Again, you're still using the wearable, same sensors, same embedded systems. Let me see if these videos play. So you can actually see one of our lab members, he's holding up his hand. We're able to break down all the anatomy of the hand using Google Media Pipe, which we refined. The individual is pointing around a library where he's unfamiliar with, and you can see a virtual laser being projected. This is all digitally, grabbing the objects and describing them so he knows where the chairs are, he knows where the table is. We can give him all these spatial features so he can figure out how to independently control his life. Okay? That's some more videos. This is another cool one. You can see again, we're able to pick up all the anatomy just in one image frame of the hand. And what is cool is in this demo, we're basically playing the different options to describe scenes. So what he's doing is he's swiping his hand from left to right like a windshield wiper. That's a gestural indication that tells the computer to do something specific and describe all of the objects in a specific orientation. So we know these objects are on the left, these objects are in the middle, these objects are on the right. And again, this could be adaptive and updated depending on user preferences. This is some cool master's speaking score.
JR, I have a question, and I'm sure you can go over, by the way.
Okay, great.
Time-wise. The quick question is, all these navigation devices, they work for walking, let's say, right? Is there in your mind, a maximum speed where they're still efficient?
Yeah, good question. You mean speed of the end user, or are you talking about the speed? Okay.
Speed of walking.
Speed of walking. Yeah, great question.
Or running.
So, a typical gait speed across the board, sort of wide spectrum, no chronic illness, no impairment, is probably around 1.5 meters per second. On average, most investigations so that blind individuals tend to walk between like 0.5, 0.6 meters per second to let's say 1.2 meters per second, so they're walking quite a bit slower. The good news is that if you're walking within those speeds, all of these technologies tend to work. The problem is when you start to walk really quickly, unfortunately some of these camera systems, there's more motion artifact. And so sometimes the effect of these technologies is affected to a small margin. But the good news is that if we're using a mobile handset like our iPhone or a lot of these Android devices, the camera technology is amazing, and they have technology to counteract the motion. So each of these camera systems, the little unit that sits at the back of the phone, it's not going to have nothing to do with this. This is another lecture. But basically, they have these little magnetic sensors that adjust for motion. If you've seen any people sort of film a movie, and you have these really cool sort of motion adjusting gimbals, you can think of all of these smartphones now having these little gimbals. So even if I move my phone around, my phone is constantly adjusting for my motion. So I share all that deal because the bottom line is we're able to move more and move faster, and the technology can still work. Particularly if we're using mobile handsets like current iPhones and current Android devices. Did I answer your question?
Yes, and I would say is another 10 minutes or so good for you? Or?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Any other question?
There's another question? Yeah, go ahead, chat. I'd like to see where you are.
It's Tom back here. I have because you kind of went into something. I got a new car, much newer than I used to have, and I've been blown away by how amazing, like, I'm too far right, I'm doing this, I'm backing up. And you kind of talked about that.
Yes.
But a lot of the guys that I spend a lot of time with, it's a very simple. Have you guys thought about like a headband connected to the glasses where just give them the simple, oops, going to hit that.
You got about like tactile prompting.
Yeah, what you did with the, just like you were doing with the curve. Just to give them a simple,
Yes.
too much, too far, hitting something.
Yeah. Great question. In fact, that's the belt which I sort of zipped through is basically giving you just that. There have been a couple of devices, but the beauty of the belt is you can actually do what we call a 3D to 2D transformation. So when you have a headband, unfortunately, I'm basically limiting myself from oftentimes one dimension, right? So I have one set of actuators or vibration units, and then I'm trying to reduce, in certain aspects, my environment that is obviously in 3D. Now I can recapture depth, like you talking about with your new car sensors, right? By increasing the frequency of the alert. So it goes beep, 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 beep. But the problem is if I have tall versus shorter obstacles and I'm using a headband, if I only have one row of actuators, then I'm limited to that one row. So I can't differentiate tall or up from down or low. So the beauty of the belt, and the reason we decided to stick with that, is we have these modular units. They're wireless. You just clip them on, right? You can turn as many of them on as you want, so you can have 6 in your backpack. And then immediately it sort of gives you that 2D summary of space. So you have several rows of actuators on these little clips. So if I have an obstacle that's head height, I would vibrate the top of the top of that unit. If I have something that's low, I would vibrate the bottom. But the beauty is, as I put that around, I can get that left to right summary of space. But using multiple rows of actuators, I can actually communicate the verticality of the obstacles in my environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just going to shut down my lab when I get home because I was working on this.
No problem. Happy to collaborate. Anytime. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, events. Sure.
I everybody to snatch.
Yeah, great question.
You know, I'm also from New York. I don't need a mic. Is there an effort to put that same quality camera into a pair of glasses so
Yes.
it's very discreet and you're just walking around and moving your head? Okay, so the answer
Great question. The answer is yes, but Neil's timely question on the sensors in the phone, there are huge differences between the cameras and that motion neutralizing technology that I have in the mobile handset compared to the Meta glasses. So we are trying to think about using Meta glasses and other smart wearables and smart headsets, but there are huge, and I can't overemphasize this, huge differences between the technology in those headsets and the quality of the cameras compared to what I have in my mobile handset. There's been so much technology discovery and investment in the cameras that I have in those mobile handsets because no one uses digital SLR camera technology where everyone's using a phone. And so they put a ton of time and effort into that. So we started to do those comparisons, but there are huge differences. So we meet exactly this quality. But good question, and we're working on it. We're having different mounts that we're working on for the phone, working on other ways that we can get it working, which is as accurate using other approaches.
Then just like a quick comment, if you can't be a wonderfully successful Apple company, put that camera into a pair of glasses.
Yeah, great question, and they're working on that, and their first product in the AVP is about $3,000. So hopefully, they come up with a cheaper form factor. But yeah, I mean they have it. It's just a matter of repurposing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Good question.
Quick question. Kevin, here I'm also from New York.
Oh, right.
You mentioned like sensors in the phone. Does it matter what type of phone you have?
So good question. It depends on the technology, but for the most part, if you're using any of the modern generation phones, so let's say going 4 to 5 generations back, whether iPhone or Android, in the most part it works. And we have most of these technologies, we're building them so they're cross-platform. It used to be if you go into a room with a bunch of blind folks and you say, what phone are you using? you say who's using iOS and iPhones, 80-90% of the audience would raise their hands. Nowadays, given the accessibility emphasis of some of the new Android and Google Play products, we're seeing that change quite a bit in recent history. So we're making that a mainstay of our lab where we develop cross platforms. So it'll be available on both and going back 4 or 5 generations.
Okay, JR, it's Corey.
Hey, Corey.
A very important question, and it might be too early in this whole process to answer, but how much does this sucker cost?
Good question. The wearable or the app?
The wearable,
The backpack. Yeah, good question. So a lot of these technologies, the curve detection, the UNAV, everything I mentioned to you, works on both platforms, whether it's the integrated vision app mobile application, which you just download through the App Store or the Google Play Store. And then the wearable itself, all these applications work on the wearable. And in most cases, because we want things to be hands-free and more ergonomic, when we do these trials, we use the wearable. The wearable right now, from a cost of goods standpoint, is about $500. So in terms of where we would ultimately market, if we were to get it on the market, it's hard to know, but sometimes technologies think about going 3 or 4x over cost of goods. And I think if we were to produce this at scale and be serious about it, we could probably get it down to under $1,000. And again, I think things will continue to improve. So we're even thinking about taking some of our learnings from the wearable and still keeping and making it into the mobile phone, but coming up with some guidance about how to buy the right mount, where the iPhone should be, and how to use it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Are these supposed to be like you use all in one, or these kind of like you use one for a specific situation or the other?
Yeah. I love that question. Great question. So
Please repeat the questions.
Yeah, sure. So the question was, can we use some of these technologies at the same time as opposed to in isolation? And so, yes, that's sort of the whole point of going with this multi-point direction and these platforms. So you can think about layering multiple services into the same core technology. So the onus isn't on the end user to think about using a drill that only has one bit, and then when I need to change the bit, I pick up another drill, which is sort of how we go through the technology world, right? Each one is sort of its own independent construct, and we think about using all of them differently. But that becomes unsustainable. So we are trying to integrate that so you can have access to all of them simultaneously. And in certain cases, we'd be able to anticipate what you need, because we won't be able to activate every software service, because then the active RAM on the phone or on the device would crash, right? Think of like I'm opening every application on my desktop. At some point, the computer's not going to work very well. Right? So we have to think about how we create the right ensemble, the right combination of services, and then we have to make sure which ones are active on that platform at the same time. So we're doing some work in that space as well. But great question. Happy to take more. Let me just plant a couple more seeds. Yeah.
And everybody here, let's
Jared's also going to be on Doctor's In, is that correct, Jared?
Yes, sir.
And he's available at lunch. So why don't we end the questions now? It's almost 12:10. And if you wrap up, JR,
Sure.
We can't thank you enough.
My pleasure, Neil. So there's a lot to go over, but I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. We have sort of an exciting finale here. But so when we think about assistive technologies, and I didn't stage these questions, when Neil brought up and with Vince brought up, are so important. We have to think about the technology itself and how we're using that camera technology to support the services that we hold near and dear to our daily functioning, right? And so what we're thinking about, a lot of what's been done traditionally in the AI space is I take a camera image, which is often in high definition. So if we've ever sent a photo to a friend, it asks you what file size you want to use, right? And so that's because that high definition photo is very difficult to send over Wi-Fi or through satellite. And unfortunately, what most technologies have been using, this is sort of spoiler alert, but really a public service announcement. What they've been doing is they've been taking the lowest quality image and then using it for the AI that you need. So the bottom line is that image quality, it has a profound impact on the performance of the technology you're using. And we were the first ones in the assistive technologies to publish these articles, and they're now being used by many folks in the assistive technology domain, and this is really critical. So what are we doing in order to improve that? We're doing what we call AI-based acceleration. The bottom line is that image quality matters for assistive technology performance. If you walk away with one thing, remember that. You want to understand how the technology works, and we need to be mindful of image quality. So we're working on ways where, depending on the network that you're in, the Wi-Fi in this hotel sucks. So I would assess how sucky it is. Am I access to satellite connections? And we would do what we call bandwidth sniffing or packet sniffing. We assess the width of the data highway, and then based on that data width, we adapt the image size appropriately, so you always get the Goldilocks effect. This means you get the best image quality based on the current network conditions. And guess what we just published on, which is exciting, is when we actually do this correctly, look at the differences I get in performance. So I'm going to describe this. On the top side, I have two different images coming from the same device. Okay, on the left-hand side, you can see shitty quality, pardon my French. On the right-hand side, you can see good quality. Now, if I run the same AI on that low quality versus the high quality, look at the amount of the obstacles that I'm detecting going from left to right, as demarcated by those arrows. Long story short, if that image is too small, the bottom line is I can pick up almost double the amount of obstacles. So if you're using the low quality images on the left-hand side, you're only picking up half of the obstacles in your environment that you may be using to negotiate or to travel. Is that acceptable or unacceptable? Unacceptable, right? This is what we have on a lot of our products that we're currently using. This is ridiculous. So we're trying to figure out new ways in what we call video adaptation to improve the innovation so you can get more impactful AI. Not with a different device. This would be figuring out how to control the quality of images. And guess what? This industry was developed around Netflix and Prime and video streaming, right? And guess what it leverages? Video adaptation. Well, we happen to pick up this trend in assistive technologies here. So we're trying to push that movement. And we're doing better and better, and the bottom line is when we do that the right way, when we have this Goldilocks effect, guess what happens? We perform better, and we have higher impact solutions. Enough said.
Thank you, JR.
Enough said.
Thank you, JR.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
All right, Neil, I want to say one more thing. So at the end of this, because I didn't have time to go into my conclusions, what we did was, we've published dozens of articles, and unfortunately, a lot of times they don't get into the hands of those who need them. So what we did was we created an appendix with a highlight reel, what we call snapshots of like the top 8 or 10 papers that we published that I think would be impactful for those in this room. We have what we call a rapid publication on human guide techniques. So this is how to travel with someone who's visually impaired. This is going to be in the video recording. I just want to make sure I spend a moment on it. We have one on human guide technique. We have one on physical therapy gaps and physical activity that everyone should be doing to improve your balance. Okay, so we all navigate safer. We have another one. We have one where we dive into some of the examples and exercise training. We have one on what we call visual hygiene, which is best practices to get more use out of your residual vision. We have one on language segmentation and some of the caveats as it relates to obstacle alerting. We have one on spatial tasks with these large language models that we're using on our Meta glasses. We have another one on food safety, which is really important, and we don't talk about this enough, which is using AI in my Meta glasses to determine if my bread is moldy or if my food is bad with perishable goods. And we have another one on ergonomics. This is published on what we call form factor matters. This is comparing mobile handsets compared to wearable headsets. And lastly, one of the ones that I'm most excited about is a publication that is about to go out on ergonomics and assistive technology. This is some work that hasn't been done before, and we're really privileged to be working on it. So again, just planting the seed. All of this will be in your recording. All of this is publicly available, and they're great learning, and education guides. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Okay, now I'm done. Out.
Thanks, JR.